Right. Okay. Recently on the television, we had some dreadful stories from girls who had been given these medical abortions. And there were dreadful stories of girls having been given one pill and then given another to take at home. And they were being sick, aborting, hemorrhaging, collapsing in public places or at home in the bathroom. Dreadful, dreadful things. And then sometime later, there was a very hard woman who was a gynecologist who came on the television and said it was all nonsense. All these chemical abortions were perfectly fine. And then a very sweet Scottish man who was a gynecologist up in Edinburgh, and he was the voice of common sense. And he said the reason that we are increasingly giving these abortions to young women, these chemical abortions, is because no doctor wants to perform them. It is a very spiritual thing, having a child. And he said nobody is ever addressing the fact that so many of these girls suffer from terrible depressions having had a termination. Some of them never get over it, and some of them never have another child. And you have to ask yourself, what are these girls doing, having sex with a man who has no care for them and is not prepared to support them if they produce a child? So these poor girls go off, and having given their spiritual strength to a man who really doesn't care tuppence about them, they then go off and have a termination, which probably does them irreparable harm. But also, something that we don't realise is the irreparable harm that is being done to the unborn child. And bear in mind that reincarnation is a fact, and we can be the unborn child in the future. Every one of us, if this goes on, we also could be aborted and suffer the most terrible harm. So there are two dictations about abortion, one done in 1975 and one a little later. And then I've got a final dictation to do about this, about how the entity is based in the body of the unborn child. And I might also mention two other things. One that was years ago, I was driving into London listening to Radio 4, and they used to have a programme called In the Psychiatrist's Chair. And the psychiatrist said, and this must have been 30 years ago, he said that in his experience, girls who had had a termination became vegan only within about a year after having had the termination. And so many girls are turning to vegetarianism these days because I think not only do they worry about animals, but they also, so many of them, lose respect for themselves because they are, through peer pressure and one thing or another, just giving themselves to all sorts of people. And it's upsetting men as well. So this is something that we have to think about. So I'll start off with this thing about abortion. So this was done in 1975. So there's two. One is very badly written, actually. So anyway, I'll start with this one. December 1975. The foolish, promiscuous acts of young people who have discovered how the physical act of procreation or sex works, a truth which can be learned in only a very few moments, but who yet have no knowledge or understanding whatsoever as to the proper structure of human society, or the true spiritual meaning of sex and procreation, can have no idea of the spiritual ills they bring about, not only on themselves, but all too often to others yet unborn. For just as there are physical diseases of the flesh, such as venereal disease, I mentioned about syphilis, there are parallel sicknesses of the spirit, much more difficult to cure. Sudden death to a living person brought about at the hands of careless, wasteful mankind is also a tremendous shock to the spirit, And in such cases, divine power must place these shocked and frightened souls in what one can only describe, for want of any other word understandable to mankind, in a spiritual hospital or place of restoration. Just as there are those here who care for the sick and have knowledge of the physical ills, so there are those who have deep knowledge of all the spiritual sicknesses and how to nurse them back to spiritual health. The afflicted who have come to them suddenly and violently from the physical world. Aborted babies very often come into this category. Procreation works in such a way, like a computer, that if the correct set of human genes are fused together during intercourse or physical union between two persons, then the corresponding human soul, perhaps not really destined to be born at that time, must be quickly prepared for life and will be born into that body. If that body inside the mother is then suddenly destroyed, this spiritual entity or soul has been through a very greatly disturbing experience and must be carefully nursed back to spiritual health before it can resume its place and in the rest planes from whence it came. The kind of evil men who commit rape upon an innocent victim, whose progeny are not destroyed, sometimes have released other evil people into the world, souls imprisoned for the sake of others, and just as they are here in this physical world until they can be sufficiently corrected for release, such physical lives should always be terminated for the sake of others. So then there was this other one, which I think was 1975, 1976. The writer's attention has been drawn to a statistic of 160,000 abortions performed in this last year of 1975-76, possibly in the year of 76 and the year of 77, a similar number of abortions will be performed. Anyone who has a small ability in arithmetic can work out these numbers for themselves. And in fact, these doctors who were talking on the television that I described earlier at the beginning of this talk, were talking about, just at the beginning of this year, 350,000 abortions so far in this country alone, and that only about 30% had been performed before 12 weeks, because it's at 12 weeks that the entity is put into the forming body. And that is the terrible, terrible danger. Let it be understood that out of the number of 160,000, possibly 100,000 souls thus murdered, for this is what these figures must represent in human life, have been harmed by this in some way. Many of them must be reborn as malformed or deformed or autistic children. Future events and statistics will prove this as fact and will show how the ignorance and folly of careless mankind, who thinks to treat lightly the creation of a human being and the creation, what is more, of himself, will pay in the end in anguish and sorrow for his own actions. Many girls who abort their children have cast untold misery into their own families, as such children harmed will only be borne back either into their own families or into the family of the young man who sired the unfortunate infant in the beginning. So it is that the follies of mankind are only visited back on himself and upon his children, and in the end they will reap so much of the sorrow and unhappiness of this world that in the beginning he has only sown himself. If mankind cannot come to understand the real meaning of abortion, not only in physical terms but in spiritual terms, and then if this mass murder of unborn infants continues and spreads throughout this world, every living person runs the risk of one day being reborn and aborted, and possibly spiritually harmed in this way, a harm which may take the course of many different physical lives to correct, in some cases never, as such a shock as abortion is to the spirit is so great that many never really recover from it. Let those who disbelieve this fact await events of the next few years, and there will be a startlingly large rise in the incidence of malformed, mentally handicapped, autistic and Mongol children. And that has become a fact now. We're in 2019, and it's very common for people to have children suffering from autism and various things. So this has become, this was a prophecy that is very horrid. And I must tell you of a friend who came to me who was doing a course in NLP, and somebody very advanced asked to regress her. And she regressed her back into her mother's womb in this lifetime. And she said, "What can you see?" And she said, "Oh, awful, red and purple and knives all round me. It's very frightening." Anyway, she went to one of her sisters because her mother had been married twice, and they were living in a Catholic South American country. And her mother had 2 daughters by the first marriage, and then she had another daughter with her second marriage, which was very, very happy, and didn't want any more children, but then found she had conceived my friend. So she obviously did a lot of soul searching and went to a backstreet abortionist. And it was her older sister, one of her older sisters, who told her about it. She said, "Well, we never told you." In this instance, my friend was extremely lucky, and really so was her mother. Her mother lost a lot of blood and had a terrible infection and had to go to hospital. And the doctors obviously knew what she had done. But they said, "Oh, you're very lucky that, the child is, you've lost a lot of blood and you've had a terrible infection, but the child is safe." So, and she didn't go on, didn't try that again. So, isn't that terrible that somebody can be made? So it is somewhere in your psyche which must explain why some of these children are born not only physically damaged, but mentally damaged. So that's that. So, there's this other thing about abortion. For the first time in living history now in your modern world, everyone is accepting that the mother of an unborn child must have the right to decide whether that child shall live or not. It has been decided in England by several important court cases that the father has no right in this direction. It is the body of the female that is most concerned, and she alone who is giving life. So if she wills, she can destroy it. Abortion is not new. Girls in the distant past, not so distant past, have often destroyed themselves as well in an effort to rid themselves of a child they no longer want. Almost always, the more civilized and intelligent people become, the less they seem to want children and the trouble of rearing them. It is the greatest pity that there are not more white women who have the simple and gentle love for their children of so many of the most ignorant and backward black people who live in direst poverty. They have one thing that is fast disappearing in the Western world: large and strong family clans. In the physical world, people are really blind to the truth about creation and how it all happens. Everyone knows that first some sort of mating must take place, whether it be for lowly animals or higher animals, or for the highest of all, mankind himself, who is only the ultimate animal if the truth be understood and accepted. After death, he does not become divine, never. Firstly, everyone must come to know that all creatures of living creatures, and plants as well, can only take place in the living physical world by the fusion of male and female cells. The various process for these fusions is very simple for even a child to understand, but difficult for the very young to accept it, as it applies to themselves and their beloved parents. Today, the concept of the stalk and the gooseberry bush has almost disappeared by the explicit and terrible films that even young children are subjected to continually, if their parents do not protect them from it. Secondly, let it be understood that all creation, even the planets themselves, exist on 2 structures at once, and both can be destroyed and reduced to an infinitesimal speck, too small to be seen even on the strongest microscope. The tiny seed that creates humanity, both in male and female, and carried in the young adult body, is very much more complicated and difficult to understand than even the most highly experienced and clever scientists and biologists understand. All those who are Christians, Buddhists, and many, many other types of belief are firmly convinced that there is life after death, life in paradise, or several planes of paradise, and that once the physical body dies, they rise up to a new life. If there were only one body, whatever sort of body do those who have such beliefs imagine they would inhabit? Is life after death a sort of cloudy existence, with those who live there floating around like some sort of gas? This would be impossible. If anybody thinks sensibly about such a thing, and very distressing for anyone who is forced to live in such a body, this book is being dictated to the writer by those of us who are determined that the living shall have the whole truth about all of those questions that everyone asks, and for which so far there has never been any proper logical answer. As we have said at the beginning, all those things that you need to know are simple and logical. Such mysteries as there are, you need have no knowledge of here. Some mysteries are so complicated that no one really knows the complete answer. Everything on both structures exists by various powers of electricity, and not simply the same sort as that which powers an electric light bulb or an electric motor as you now have them in your modern world. The human body and its counterpart on our structure, the life after death body, if you like, look much the same and are powered the same. As the tiny male sperm unites with the female ovary in the human beings, of all colours and types, it is exactly the same. The physical body begins to form. The male sperm is powered by electricity, and every single sperm from any male body is the exact carbon copy of the person in whose body it is housed. If he has a long, thin nose, tall, thin limbs, and a tendency to thinness, then that instruction will be fed into the female ovary. And each one of those, which is simple, very tiny, and amazingly powerful complex computer, is similar. They are all exactly the same. Everyone will ask, how is it then that in every family where there is more than one child from the same parents, that no two brothers and sisters are ever the same? Either in looks, thought, or even speech, they are all different. Everyone knows that there are two types of male sperm, those that create male children and those that create female children. It is not known that there are also within the female ovary various different characteristics that will create male offspring or female offspring more readily, usually in alternate months. Some women create more female ovaries, some male, and they do not always create them in exactly the same sequence. I presume that's eggs rather than ovaries. Very much of the exact mechanics of birth are a mystery, an amazingly wonderful mystery. In the very beginning, until what is known as the quickening, when the child begins to move about inside the body, there is no other body forming, and there is therefore no person or spiritual entity within the forming embryo. Quickening or movement is the sign, that is to say, not revolving around in a haphazard sort of way, but real movement of limbs, the sign that the person is now beginning to develop. Where has this person come from, the intelligent person might ask. Later we might speak of reincarnation, which no one understands, let alone believes in. It has already been dictated to the writer that some return to life and others never within this planet. The universe is enormous, vast, so much so that no ordinary human being can possibly comprehend it. Imagine that someone has died, that he or she arrives on the other side where we who are dictating this chapter and the book live. Firstly, he will be taken into some sort of hospital or reception centre where skilled technicians, just as you have them here, but much more knowledgeable, will carefully examine the newly arrived body to see if it is fit and well enough for the person inside it to take up his or her place on the rest planes. If the body is very damaged, then the body must be destroyed electrically, and the person placed in a place of storage until some sort of life can be found for him or her. The well-being of the physical body does have its effect on the other electrical body, if you like to call it that, which when separated from its host decaying body, neither needs to eat, excrete, or procreate, as it has no facility for either. Neither body will last forever, but the non-physical body will last very much longer than the physical one, and can, if very carefully looked after and given an electrical charge every so often, last for thousands of years, if the owner wishes to remain on this structure that long, and is in such a position of power that he or she can be given or demand to be given this extra life force charge. Before birth or rebirth, any person who has lived on the rest planes for some time must be taken away and prepared for birth. This means that his or her body on this structure must be extinguished. Remember that the basic entity, which is man, has no body, cannot be destroyed in any way, and must be most carefully stored away and labelled. It is as simple as that, a computerized label of such complexity that only a computer could come to work it out and give the necessary instructions for its eventual disposal, if any suitable parents of the right genealogy arrive. Only certain parents can possibly give life to certain children. If abortion takes place after about the 15th week, then a person who has been most carefully placed in the host mother is destroyed. not just a physical body, and this is a very important piece of information which the living must come to know and understand. In fact, I think probably one shouldn't go beyond, I think it's the 12th or the 13th week is when most little entities go in. One must argue, so what, when the unfortunate person must be restored to store once more, or he or she, having lost both bodies and unable to live anywhere, because without one or either body there is no possibility for life. Indeed, the unfortunate person thus deprived does not know anything whatsoever, and sleeps, to put it in that terms, until called upon to live once more. The tragic fact is that when abortion or destruction of the unborn child takes place with the person or entity inside the tiny forming body, this can have far-reaching and terrible effects upon the minute, complicated, precious person forming, wrenched away from the tiny wrecked mess of forming body, that the person may, in a later lifetime, become a Mongol or an autistic or a very deranged or ruined person, undetected, because there is absolutely no way that any technician on either structure can be sure how much damage has been done. What about a natural miscarriage? That is very different. And nature has a fail-safe mechanism, which means that if the forming child is not up to standard, then the body will not come to full term. In the case of those who do come to full term, then a medicine becomes more efficient, and as medicine becomes more efficient and knowledgeable, such bodies must be extinguished before birth. We here think that it is dreadfully cruel to force any living creature to live in a hopelessly deformed body from birth, even blind. Such people come to terrible suffering, which can often have far-reaching effects on them in later lives, sometimes not one life, but many, many after it. However many lifetimes someone lives, he or she will be much the same, rather like an actor who puts on a different costume to play different parts. He may, with a different parent, have bad eyesight, a longer nose, be a little taller, have longer or shorter legs, be thinner or fatter. But those of us who watch the living, you can always see that he or she is the same person returned to life. In some mysterious way, once the entity or seed, which is the living person, is placed inside the forming embryo, then the real characteristics which will become the living person begin to be formed by the very entity itself. This is why it is possible for the same parents to produce such varying and different children, some looking very different to others, and some very much cleverer, even taller, and quite opposed in looks. It's not known the exact way that the spiritual entity works upon the living flesh, on both structures at once, but it is extremely delicate and precious. Any interference with this forming infant, once the whole becomes a complete entity, a living person, causes terrible harm to a possible future person. No abortions of any sort should ever take place once quickening has begun, unless the embryo has been discovered to be faulty. Let all living persons remember that everyone is involved. One lifetime is not nothing, but it is only one bead in the entire necklace of many lives. If abortion is regarded as casually as it is now and allowed to continue at any time before the birth, then there will be many millions of those who are living now who may come to terrible harm in future incarnation. How many childless couples are there now in the Western world who cannot adopt children because they have no children for them to adopt? We know that it will never be possible to have a perfect world, and mistakes will always happen. But we hope in the future that future mothers will come to understand the tremendously important work that they do in creating life. Without the work of bringing intelligent children into the world, there can be no world. For what is a world without people in it? And what is more healthy people about, which we shall speak in another chapter.